Good morning. I'm the three-piece conservative, and today I will be discussing what is admittedly, just in my own view, the pros and cons of the right wing. Obviously, the conservative in my channel's name may tip you off. I may be a tad biased. However, I do think there are some real flaws in the current right-wing mainstream. Later on, I'll be providing you my take on the pros and cons of the left wing. As always, I hope you exercise your right to freedom of speech as much as you do your right to listen, and you leave a comment detailing your view along with anything you feel I may have forgotten, misrepresented, and so on. So this will be essentially taking the format of one con, one pro, until I have said everything that needs to be said and only one side is remaining. No prizes for guessing which one that is. To start with the cons. Con 1. Today's right wing tries to be the opposite of the radical left. Now, this is a big issue, especially in countries like America, as rather than taking what is, in my view, the actual right-wing approach and simply coming up with ways to ensure the economy remains/becomes strong, that personal liberties are protected and that the free markets are established, and so on, the right wing starts weighing into debates it never really had any official stance in. Take, for example, the argument over same-sex marriage. Now, I don't really care what your stance is. However, other than maybe some small boost to the economy, same-sex marriage doesn't really concern the ideology of the right wing. What it does concern is the ideology of a person. Although the media spins this to be some sort of right versus left, it's not. The left, being focused first and foremost on equality, living standards, and that sort of thing, naturally has a stake in marriage equality, as it's called. But why do you find that the right wing are weighing into this? For no other reason than because they need to, in order to counter the left. Really, although it is the responsibility and not just a right to get married, being anti-same-sex marriage goes against the right-wing idea of personal liberties, of the rights and ideas of the free market. That if anybody wants something or wants to do something that doesn't harm any others, they deserve the right to do so, so long as they can afford it, of course. As I said, you may argue it harms you by diminishing the sanctity of marriage, but it doesn't hurt you, and it doesn't physically coerce you. And I don't claim to know what the argument against gay marriage is in its most eloquent form, but the right has only weighed into it due to the fact that the left weighed into it. The same is true for abortion and many other moral issues. Pro 1. The right believes in personal responsibility and accountability. I consider it self-explanatory, but in this world where everyone sues one another and everyone gets offended, the idea that you are responsible for your own actions is very important and, in my mind, very noble. The advocating of the idea that if you want to spend less money for a less safe car, that is your choice, not the government's and not the car companies, and only you should pay the consequences for it. It's a difficult thing to argue that point, but it is vital that we do, as it is paramount to a free society. Freedom requires us to make up our own opinions and our own minds and take our own choices, and the right allows for this to happen. Con 2. It mixes religion with politics, which, much like courts and parliament, should never be mixed. This allows for similar outcomes to the first con. However, this is an issue caused by people refusing to accept that they are not the right wing. Although someone may interpret the right wing as they may interpret their own religion, it does not mean that the two should be mixed. By this I mean, when somebody says God supports America's efforts in doing something, this usually comes from a right-winged individual and is advertised as such. But in order for the political view, being the right wing, to move forward, it must detach itself from the social baggage of people trying to attach a political view based on free markets, capitalism, personal liability, and liberty, and generally an economic focus to every question of the day. It allows for free markets and capitalism. Pro 2. Now, I will be explaining what I mean by free markets and why I think they are good later on, but what I mean is the right is the supporter of the successful. When someone works long hours, takes on higher education, and invests their money, the right seeks to reward them, or at least not punish them, by not forcing them to pay large taxes just because they have worked harder. One criticism of the left I have is that they punish the success of people and the successful. Con 3. It is tamed down rather than pushed harder in the modern world. Now, this perhaps is a bit more complex of an issue, but what I mean by this is, and if we may take Australia for an example, the Liberal government, being our right-wing government, is trying to push through a bill that would essentially stop paying pensions to the retired and considerably wealthy. That is not a right-wing stance. That is giving in to the left, saying, oh well, we have financial issues, so let's target the rich. Rich, of course, being in the eye of the beholder. And I'm not saying moderates aren't useful and that they're bad. No, I think they're very important. But there is compromising in your position, then there is just plain submission. In today's world, at least in the West, the ideas of people expressing their point of view with the dollar is lost. When a company makes an unsafe car, if I may reuse that example, it's not the consumer's fault for purchasing a car for a cheaper price at the cost of safety. No, it's the company's fault. Similarly, right-wing governments across the world are raising the minimum wage rather than abolishing it. That is, of course, a big issue and something I will go into later in more depth, but that is an anti-capitalist practice. It is not right-winged. So we see the right-wing parties trying to act more central, thereby getting nothing useful done. It is not a compromising that's going on here. It is simply submitting to the left. Pro 3. It respects the freedoms of people. The right wing, in theory, will acknowledge an individual has a right to do what they will with their own body. Things like conscription and the war on drugs never should have occurred in a right-wing government, certainly not primarily under them. For example, Robert Menzies allowing conscription for the Vietnam War, and Nixon declaring a war on drugs during his presidency. In today's society, freedoms and liberties are constantly handed over, and in such a ruddy way it leaves me worried. So I think the true right-wing way of governing needs to be applied. Con 4. It often acts in a cruel manner. Once again, to use Australia as the example, I'm sorry, but I do live there, turning back the boats sounds like a horrible idea at a moral level, to deny refugees access to a first world nation, and instead putting them in detention centres and in other such places. Now, I admit it's not often a con, as usually it's the tough love decision. Case in point, no refugees have drowned in capsized boats under the Liberal government, the same of which cannot be said under the former Labour government, which is our left-wing party. However, it does lead to an idea and a representation of the right wing not being considerate of the well-being of the average man, which is what the left thrives on. Pro 5. A practicing right-wing style of leadership will always be cheaper. I acknowledge the absolute sets me up to be disproven. However, the smaller governments the right wing offers will always be cheaper to run than large governments that the left proposes, meaning lower taxes and generally reduced expenditure. It also means the government will be run more efficiently, as the more you delegate, the more time you have to focus on what remains. Leading on from this is Pro 6. It also means that there is privatisation. I acknowledge in some industries privatisation is a bad thing, but when the government keeps exclusively what is necessary and little else, this allows for more private businesses or public-private partnerships to make profits, hire workers, pay taxes, and so on, where otherwise an industry would just be costing the government money, and taxpayers their money at that. Pro 7, and the last one for this brief outline. The right wing is fundamentally inclusive. As I said in the early part of this video, people mould the right wing to fit their own worldview. However, the right wing essentially supports the idea that if you can buy it, you can have it. And if it harms no one else, or at least no one that doesn't wish to get harmed, you have every ability to do it. The beauty of capitalism and the free markets is that it doesn't care about your race, creed, colour, sexuality, sex, religion, or anything of the sort. It just cares about how much you can make and how much you have made. Consider it like video games in their ideal. People on your team don't really care who you are, and for the most part, or at least as far as I can tell, they care far more about your ability to play the game and how good you are at it. That's what matters to them. And if being judged on your ability isn't equal and inclusive, I truly don't know what is. To end on a quote from Milton Friedman, "If you try to get equality before liberty, you'll get neither."